Report with Idaho Freedom Foundation President Wayne Hoffman, one of Idaho's most respected, influential public policy voices.
Hey, welcome everybody to another Hoff Time Report. Glad to have you here. It's snowy as we speak, and it's like winter all over again. I thought spring was just around the corner, but there's a blizzard in Boise.
Gonna have to dig my car out after this.
Oh yeah, what a shame. It's terrible. Anyway, welcome. We have Representative Ilana Rubel, who's the House Minority Leader. She's been on the program before, so no stranger to the people who've been watching this show for a while. But wanted to just kind of catch up and see how the legislative session is going, and get your thoughts on some key issues and things we'll disagree on probably, and things maybe we will agree on. Who knows? We just don't know where. But I wanted to start with this article that I don't believe anything that I read in the news media, but this one was just kind of funny to me because it says Idaho Democrats call on lawmakers to move on priorities instead of hot button issues. And the first sentence in here is Idaho Democratic leaders are. This is from March 8th. Is that today or is it March 6th?
I think it's probably from today. We had it probably
Is
from
it
the
from
press
today?
conference
It
we
was
had yesterday.
Was it okay? Good. Okay, so it says that you're calling on the Republicans to start addressing the governor's priorities, and so I thought that was kind of interesting, just in that you were asking for the Republican-controlled legislature, the majority party, 85, 86%, to follow the governor's priorities. Is he the titular head of your party now, or what's
Definitely
happening
not.
here?
Well, we actually that was a bit of a tweak that I think the media covering it made. That's not what we said. What we said in the press conference was we want to start addressing the real issues facing the people of Idaho. I knock doors like nobody else. Maybe Steve Birch knocks more than I do, but
Steve Birch knocks a lot of doors.
He knocks a lot of doors, but I'm close behind him. I've knocked over 20,000 doors, and people want bread and butter issues addressed. They want to lower their property taxes. They want to make sure teachers are getting paid enough that they'll keep working. They want to make sure our bridges and roads are in good repair. And nothing we're doing this session, it feels like, is addressing those things. It's all just, drag queens and transgender care and firing squads and all these hot button issues. And we're not doing, it feels like, the real work of what'll actually make people's lives better.
Well, let's talk a little bit about some of those issues because, I mean, you have voted affirmatively on some of the things in the governor's proposal, and you voted against some of these, I guess, what you call hot button issues. But take House Bill 71, for example, which was the bill that I know for some reason I'm really bad at numbers, but this year I've been extraordinarily good at remembering numbers, and everybody else doesn't remember the numbers.
So many numbers, you'll have to give me refreshers as you throw the numbers out.
So 71 was the bill that passed the House, and it basically said that you couldn't perform gender procedures on minors. I hear people talk about that all the time. That doesn't seem like something that's not a non-issue, but tell me your perspective.
Well, it's I think for most of the people that are talking about it, it's probably not an issue in a lot of people's lives. The transgender community is very, very small. I guess I would take issue with the characterization, because if it were just about the procedures, the actual surgeries, I think we all would have been fine with that. They don't even happen in Idaho, so it wouldn't really matter. It's not the standard of care. People are not doing sex change surgeries on minors in Idaho. So, we'd be totally fine with that being banned. The real concern about that bill was the banning of the hormone treatments. But your average person, in terms of what issues are going to affect them in their lives, the only people really affected by this are the parents of trans kids and the trans kids themselves. They don't want this bill at all. They're vehemently opposed to this. You will not find a trans kid in this state who's actually transgender now who says they want this bill. The parents of trans kids don't want it. The people who want it are the people who are outside of the trans community who want to inflict it on those who are in the trans community. But again, I think it's a fairly fringe issue. Some people are worked up about it, but most people, when you talk to them, would really much rather see their property taxes go down than put a ban on somebody else from what kind of health care they can get.
So what I guess part of along those lines, I don't remember anybody saying, at least until now, that we need $8,500 per high school graduate to go into in-demand careers, and yet that became suddenly a top of the line issue as well for many Republicans and Democrats, and it was a combination of the two, the complete I think that all the Democrats in the House caucus, if I remember correctly, I don't think anybody voted against that.
Yeah.
And then there was some number of Republicans that came along, and it was 36 votes to pass the bill. So that, and we're talking about
Uh,
that. That's the governor's Idaho launch program, by the
Yeah,
way.
I
So
mean, generally speaking, I certainly hear a lot from people who want higher education to be more affordable and more accessible, and I certainly hear a lot from the business community who say we need more skilled employees. But I certainly hear from both students. You know, I have a kid who's in high school. I know that he has friends who are really struggling with whether they're going to be able to go on to not necessarily college, but culinary school, carpentry school. I mean, any not just for your colleges, but the affordability is a concern. No, I didn't write the bill. Nobody talked to me before the bill was written. I don't know that it's exactly the way I would have written it, but for a couple of reasons, it does align with what I hear people telling me in terms of offering more of a path to people to go on to higher education. But personally, I feel like in the public education system, it evolved in the early part of the 20th century, right? And I think the idea was that it's the state's obligation to get people up to a reasonable level where they can go out in the world and get a job. And once upon a time in the 1950s, that was a high school education. Most people had a high school education. With high school education, you could get most jobs. If you wanted something fancy, go out and borrow or pay for it yourself. If you want to go to medical school or engineering school or whatever else, but a high school education would basically get you there. I think in the year 2023, I think probably a 2-year, college community college degree or a welding certificate is probably the equivalent of what a high school degree would have been in 1950. It's kind of that's the new baseline level of where you can get a decent job with that. Okay, make more money if you get something fancier than that, but you're really, I think, gonna be struggling if all you have is a high school diploma in the year 2023. I don't think it is quite the equalizing element that it might have been 75 years ago.
so what is that a commentary on the education system, or is that a commentary on people's expectations for what the education system is supposed to do?
Well, I mean, I guess I'm just speaking personally on what I think the education system's supposed to do. Is it's supposed to give everybody a reasonable shot to get somewhere, right? It's the great equalizer. It's the great, middle class builder. It's the great thing that gives people an avenue out of poverty. I think probably the world has changed. Nowadays, once upon a time, you could get a decent job in a factory with, very few skills. You could get a job on a farm. Now, almost anywhere you go to the factories, you're operating some really sophisticated machinery. They don't want people with just high school diplomas working in factories. You're not just nailing a nail anymore. You're operating really fancy, expensive equipment on farms. The tractors, you need a degree to to drive the tractors. I mean, they're incredibly sophisticated. They know exactly what kind of seed to drop at precisely what elevation. I mean, again, even just basic agricultural work needs more training than just a high school diploma these days.
So does that mean that I should have to pay for somebody else's um, training? Because that seems. I guess I had a conversation with a farmer in Grangeville the other day, and we
Mhm.
talked a little about this. And he was asking me questions about this. House Bill 24, by the way, if we didn't mention this. So it passed the House, 36-34. It's awaiting action in the Senate. The committee voted to send it to the amending calendar from the Senate. So I don't know what's planned with that there. Meanwhile, a trailer bill was introduced to fix some of the things people have had objections with. So some way or another, this bill is going to be amended. But the concept was bothering this farmer that I spoke to. They said, "Okay, it's for in-demand careers,"
Yeah.
and he said, "So is farming an in-demand career?" And I said, "I don't know. I mean, I have no. Is it?"
I suspect it will be. I'd be shocked if when they come up with a career list. Now, again, I didn't draft the bill, and I don't know that I would have used particularly this in-demand career
So who
language.
who is not an in-demand career then, I guess,
And
is
I
the
push
question.
back a little bit on that because,
Yeah.
having a background that probably nobody would have considered in demand. I was an English and American government major, and I've always seen the arts and all these things always denigrated. I've been on these various committees on higher education, and people are always saying, like, "Well, we want computer programmers. We don't want people out there studying film and history and art history and all these stupid degrees where you'll never get a job." And that always frustrates me because, I had one of those stupid degrees and I've always had a job and I've always worked hard and I've always been supporting myself ever since I got out of school. And I actually think people can do very important things in the world with, degrees that aren't necessarily welding or computer programming. So I was actually, and one of my kids' friends wants to be a movie director. That's never going to be on the in-demand career list.
Okay,
And but they might be the next
but
Spielberg. They might pay more taxes than all of us
so,
put together.
somebody has to pay for that director, that film director, right? And wouldn't the film director become more expensive to hire if all the would-be film directors are going into different jobs that they get $8,500 for versus the
Uh,
non-in-demand careers? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, I did push on that because again, I don't I think the world will need artists and the world does need writers and the world needs people who aren't just necessarily slotted into these 10 careers that have been blessed as in demand. But the answer that I got was that, there will be these scholarships out there for all 12,000 kids in the state who apply. And unless all, the first, let's say 6,000 apply for in-demand careers, they will get the first bite at the apple, but there will presumably be 6,000 scholarships left over for everybody else, and that will go to the people who are not going into in-demand. So the anticipation, I guess, is that there will be money there for people regardless of whether they're going into in-demand stuff or not, because I feel it feels a little bit like social engineering to me to say what's in demand. I don't know what's in demand. Again, if you're the next Steven Spielberg, you're probably going to bring more value to the state than, 1,000 welders put together.
But to me, that makes me go, "Oh my gosh, the government is picking winners and losers." I mean, now it's in-demand careers, before it was essential jobs or essential services. But and for a person like me, that's the deal breaker, at least one of several deal
Mm.
breakers. You look at that and you go, "Well, that's not great, but I'll vote for it anyway." Why is that?
Well, as I said, I got some comfort from the idea that, people who want to study filmmaking will get these scholarships too. That the in practicality, the way it's going to play out is the way it's structured right now, at least, is there will be money there for people to be able to go at least, the amount of money they get is designed to be basically enough to get you a 2-year community college degree or or a certificate, a carpentry certificate, something at CWI, like some kind of post-secondary certificate. It won't be enough to get you through a 4-year college. It'll get you through maybe a year and a half of a 4-year college. But as I said, conceptually, I felt like that's maybe the new high school level. Getting people to the point where they have a 2-year community college degree probably makes you about as employable as you would have been with a 12th grade degree in 1950. And I think we were all in agreement that we were okay with that. We were okay with paying to get people to that baseline level of employability. And if that baseline level of employability now means a welding certificate, I'm okay with that.
So, in addition to the House Bill 24 and the in-demand careers legislation, there was also a bill that passed. I think it was a couple days ago, maybe it was longer than that. That provided loan repayment for rural nurses, and again, a
Mhm.
great deal of support from both Democrats and Republicans to get that over in the Senate. Same kind of thinking on that. That the government has a role to play in paying off people's student loan debts.
Well, again, I didn't draft that one either, but I mean, we do have a crisis with getting nurses into rural areas, and so at some point we have to decide, and there may just be an issue where if in a pure market world, it just may not be economically viable to have people living in certain areas and living the kind of quality of life that they would like to be living and that we would like to have them living, and so at some point, I guess as a society, we have to decide if we want there to be a viable agriculture sector where people are, making the food. There's some national security interest in being self-sufficient on food production. We might have to tinker a little bit to make life livable in these areas and make sure that there's a baseline of medical access, a baseline of education access. And so, yeah, maybe some incentives are appropriate to make sure that people in these areas have a modicum of access to healthcare and aren't just left high and dry when they get sick. And there is a, pretty major crisis in access to nursing care in these areas. And so I think it didn't seem too unreasonable to me to say, okay, throw a little bit of an incentive for people who are willing to go into these underserved areas where they might not otherwise have nurses.
So, are you open to also, and it's interesting because you don't represent a rural area either,
No,
and some of your constituents probably would not benefit
nope.
from that grant program. But
Yeah.
I mean, is it fair for nurses working in Boise to pay the student loans of people working in Chalice and Soda Springs, for example?
Well, I guess we're all gonna be paying those, right? I mean, we're all gonna be paying
Right.
those, and not just the nurses, but you and I will be helping to pay that. I mean, we're all subsidizing to live in a civilized society, right? We're paying to build roads in Chalice we're never gonna drive on too. We're all paying for police officers in Post Falls who will never protect us. I mean, we're all, we're money is getting smushed all over
Well,
the state in different areas where we may not
but I
personally
have
benefit.
but I have access to that. I could always use that road. I could choose to use that road or not use that road. I may choose to use a park
Right.
or something like that. The fire department probably will not come to my house. I hope not, but if they do, then I've paid for it. But
Yeah.
on this, I'm not a rural nurse. I'm never going to be one, and so
Yeah.
I'm still paying for it. And I wonder if you think about. I mean, I talk about the barista working at Starbucks who either never went to college or got a degree that's not useful to her, and now she's working at Starbucks. And in addition to paying for her bills, she's paying somebody's nursing student loan debt.
Well, I mean, I think the nature of the beast is that, and kind of the way America's always functioned is that we all are going to pay some amount for a decent, clean, safe, civilized society that has some basic amenities, parks, schools, clean water, that kind of thing. And we're not all going to use it equally, and we're not all going to use precisely, the thing that is proportional to what we're paying for. It just wouldn't be feasible to allocate it that way. So, there may be parks that you're using disproportionately. There might be amenities that you're disproportionately enjoying, and other amenities that you're disproportionately paying for and not enjoying. But it just wouldn't be administrable to do it any other way. We couldn't really run a society where everybody is only paying precisely for the things that we're using ourselves. So we do the best we can in terms of having people pay some fair portion of their income and try to create a society that is safe and clean and reasonable for all of us, where we all have some reasonable access to, safe streets, schools, parks, healthcare.
Is that what is the measure, I guess, of a bill that you think hits the sweet spot to do that versus something that you would think is just crazy? I mean, that maybe I just wonder what your limitation is in terms of the policy. And okay, you said yes to $8,500 for high school grads. You said
Yep.
yes to student loan debt for nurses. I think last year wasn't nurses, it was something else.
Teachers.
Was it teachers? Okay,
Yep.
yeah, you said yes to teachers. That's right.
Yeah.
It was teachers.
It was teachers, and the similar deal to go into these areas, generally rural, but also very low
So
income
would
urban.
if you had the exact same bill for firefighters in rural areas, would that be okay? Or EMS drive? We hear there's EMS shortages. So I mean, where's your
Well, Wayne,
what's give, give
I hate to confess, but I actually sponsored that bill for EMS. So yeah, but yeah, I mean, if there's a part of the state where they are not economically self-sufficient to be able to pay, and this is the case, this is not hypothetical, this is reality. There were major areas of the state where they were completely unable to fund their own ambulances and their own EMS personnel. There were areas of the state where if you fell off a ladder or had a heart attack, you would be there. You call 911, you'd be there for 4 hours waiting for somebody to come. You would probably die before they got there. Well, we all want to be able to go around the state. I want to be able to go camping in salmon. I want to be able to go everywhere and not feel like I'm going to die because they don't have any emergency medical services. I think we all benefit by making sure that wherever you are in the state, when you call 911, someone's going to show up. So I'm comfortable with, and it's going to be my money. Probably, I'm going to be paying money to make sure that there is an EMS and an ambulance that shows up in Chalice, because they wouldn't have one otherwise. I'm just using Chalice as an example, but the hypothetical rural area that can't fund it themselves. But in terms of what criteria would I want to see? Well, I'd want to see that it's a pretty necessary service and that there's a dire need and that it's not going to probably happen unless we assist.
But it's fun to kind of go down these hypothetical rabbit holes because I like to get inside your head a little bit to understand you. But like, so for
It sounds
example,
like you wouldn't enjoy being inside my head at all, Wayne.
I
I
don't
don't
know. I
know.
might. I'm just sitting there. I find it very fascinating. So let's say let's go to Mackey. I don't know if there's a grocery
Sure.
store in Mackey, but let's say that somebody says, "My gosh, this is what do they call it? A food desert. There's not enough grocery stores here in the area." Or maybe I know Hazelton. I don't think Hazelton has a grocery store. They might have a convenience store or some kind of little C store, but there's no grocery store. They have to drive all the way to Burley or Twin Falls in order to get their food. And somebody comes along and says, "Here is a government-owned and operated grocery store,"
Yeah.
or we're gonna subsidize people's travel to the grocery store in Burley so they can get food. Is that an appropriate
Well, I
use
mean,
of?
you raise a good point in that, and I'm not I'm fundamentally a capitalist. I don't want to see government grocery stores. I don't want to see government everything, right? I think there's a gray area where there are some services that are traditionally, kind of aligned with some government help. I mean, there has been a history and a tradition of public schools, for example, and that we are going to provide people access to public education wherever they live. And so we might operate schools that aren't particularly financially viable. And I mean, there's places where they're running schools with 6 students in them that, probably are higher cost than running a school in my district. Medical care is one of those areas where we have provided a government baseline where, we're not just going to let you die. The government will step in to cover these things. Supermarkets, I wouldn't say is one of those areas. And I don't know that I'd be looking to expand the kinds of areas where
Well, you say that, but there have been stories recently where folks, the city governments in certain pockets of the country have actually bought the local grocery store. And I think there was one in Washington State, maybe one in, was it Indiana? I don't remember exactly, but they've actually bought the local grocery store, and because it was going out of business and they didn't have a grocery store in town, so they said, okay, we're gonna operate the store. I mean, it's all plausible. I mean, the city of Boise runs an ice rink for crying out loud. Some, obviously libraries, baseball
yeah.
stadiums, football fields, liquor stores. I mean,
Well,
all the liquor stores are run by the state. That is not inconceivable that you could draw a quick line from grocery stores to from liquor stores to grocery stores, right?
well, I mean, that's an interesting question. To some extent, I think it's a very interesting question. To some extent, I think you might need to ask at some point when it's completely economically non-viable for people to live in a certain area and where you have to build this entire superstructure of government just to keep people alive in that area. At some point, you might have to ask the question of, is there a vital state interest to be served by people living in this area? Are they, you know, does it make sense to absorb a huge amount of state costs to make sure that services are continually being provided to somebody in that area? Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. I don't know that I would be the first one to jump on board on state covered grocery stores. That said, I do think there's a place if you have an elderly person who's living in poverty. We do have programs that would bring them food. They do have food stamps. I mean, we do have a social safety net to try to stop people from starving to death. And, to the extent that it would fall within that framework. But no, I don't think I would be on board with the government just setting up a supermarket. Um,
So that's the limit. There is some kind of compelling state interest. I'm not gonna put words in your mouth, but some kind of compelling state interest, some obvious traditional bands of government service, perhaps.
yeah, I think generally.
Okay,
Yeah.
but you would. I mean, at the same time, we're having a conversation. We've not traditionally put much state taxpayer money into childcare. But I mean, 7 or 8 million dollars, I think, and the rest of it is all federal money of some kind. But we're talking about that now. How much money should the state and others subsidize childcare? And the state government, the federal government, that's
Yeah.
not traditional
Well, it is traditional in some places. It
in
hasn't
some
been yeah,
places.
in many places it is traditional. In fact, many countries it's standard. It's sort of part of the package that you get in many countries where you get, public school and access to public childcare. We don't live in a purist libertarian regime, right? We live in a kind of a bit of a squishier world where the government does take a role in generally trying to facilitate economic growth, facilitate economic success. Sometimes when you get too purist, you can actually hurt your economy. There are areas where you can say, oh, absolutely not. People are on their own. This is not an appropriate role of government. But the upshot can be real economic damage. And I think there might be some of that in the childcare arena where if people don't have access to childcare, they can't work. If childcare providers can't operate, they don't become available. They're not available for the workforce, and you start seeing economic shrinkage. And to some extent, I think some government investment in these areas can make sense to make sure you have a fertile ground for economic growth. And childcare very much logically fits in that arena. That's not picking winners and losers. That's an area that applies to all industries, whether you're in whatever you're in, whether you're in law enforcement or manufacturing or food service or whatever you're in, you probably need childcare.
But you complain, and members of your party complain a lot about how the Idaho legislature operates.
Mhm.
True?
Yeah.
And yet you still feel comfortable saying to Idaho state government, "You take on this responsibility, it's gonna somehow work out right." Is that how do you square those 2 concepts?
Wait, I'm not sure. I don't see the disconnect there.
Well, I mean, if you think the government's not doing a very good job, now you go to the legislature every day and you see government and how it's working up close and personal, and then you say, "Let's go and expand on that."
Well, actually, I think the nuts and bolts of government work better than our legislature does.
So you
You
think
know,
it's just the legislature is an outlier?
I think the legislature is not, yeah, I have some issues with how the legislature works. But in terms of how our agencies work, overwhelmingly, I think it's not bad. I think the agencies work better than the legislature does.
And you trust these different agencies to take on more responsibility and
I mean, I'm sure you can find areas where they screw up, but overall, I think they're hardworking folks who generally do a good job. I'm on the Health and Welfare Committee. I interact with the Department of Health and Welfare a lot. I know they get pilloried and attacked, but on the whole, when I see it up close and personal, I see these folks are working hard to administer a foster care system, and they're working hard to diligently screen foster parents and check in and make sure everything's okay. I see them checking in on old folks and people with dementia. I see them checking in on people with developmental disabilities, trying to make sure they're clean and fed and, not in a bad shape. I see them, checking on nursing facilities to make sure they're clean and safe. I actually think they're carrying out their duties pretty responsibly. Like I haven't been horrified by what I've seen at all. And I generally think, yeah, I think they're doing what I'd want them to be doing.
one of the bills that was in the Health and Welfare Committee was, to extend the, maternal mortality review committee,
Mhm.
and where's that issue right now? It sounded as if it wasn't going anywhere. So basically, by
Yeah.
way of background, folks, this committee was created 3 years ago, 4 years ago,
Yeah.
and it had a sunset date. It said that it had to expire, this year. And, so a bill came along to extend that out and then was never heard from again. I'm not
Well, actually, it was heard from. So there was a bill to extend it. So it's set to sunset in July of this year. It has been operating, and their findings, I think, were of some concern. I think it does make sense to extend that committee. It was created initially because Idaho had a very poor maternity mortality rate. The U.S. generally does, and Idaho has a very poor rate. And so the idea was say, well, why is this happening? Is it something we can fix? And I think it uncovered there were 26 maternal deaths during that time, and I think they found 16 of them were avoidable. So that says to me we've got a problem,
I'm sorry,
and
say
it's
those numbers again?
I think what I'm remembering from the committee, don't hold me to it, but I
Yeah.
remember is that they found 26 deaths during that time, and of those, 16 of them were preventable.
Oh, over the course of the 3 years, 3 or
Yes.
4 years they were, because it was I only remember the last year, which was like 12.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you're adding them all together.
Yes, over the course of the committee span, and so that showed a pretty significant number of avoidable deaths, and it was a very low price tag. I mean, the price tag on this thing is $10,000, which is, I hate to say it, a decent amount for us personally, but definitely a drop in the bucket in the state budget. But $10,000 to try to figure out why 16 people needlessly died doesn't seem like an undue expense. But I think there's a problem out there that we haven't gotten to the bottom of. And as each of these deaths unfolds, I think it's a worthwhile thing to figure out why did this happen and what could we do differently to prevent more women from dying in the future.
I mean, was there anything in there that really surprised you in the reporting? I mean, there was mental health problems,
Hmm.
and one of them said, I think this was 1, 2 or 3 years ago, but it said, we should change the state's seatbelt laws to, make it a primary, because I guess one of the women died in an accident where she didn't have her seatbelt on, and so change the seatbelt laws. But all the other ones were pretty much the stuff you'd see. It would nothing in there was surprising to me anyway. Was their findings surprising to you?
Well, I think one of the things, it did show certainly mental health issues. I think there were some suicide cases arising from postpartum depression. I think one of the things it tells us, maybe, right now, Idaho is one of the states that doesn't provide very much postpartum Medicaid access to women. They get kicked off of Medicaid when they're
There,
60 days after giving birth. Many states have extended that to 6 months or a
that was
year.
one of the proposals that
Right,
the commission or the review panel made, was to
right,
expand Medicaid, and
right.
there's a bill to do that, but that hasn't been heard from either.
No,
Is
that
that
hasn't been heard from, but that's the kind of information that you might get from a committee like that saying, okay, you have a big problem with women committing suicide postpartum. They don't have access to behavioral health and counseling because they're not on Medicaid. Maybe that's something we should look at. Maybe we could save some lives by giving women access to mental health care postpartum.
But
So,
I guess the difference of points of view for us is, see, I would look at that and go, yeah, that's terrible. We should extend. We should work with local charities to make sure that, Love Inc. and Boise Rescue Mission and gosh, Catholic Charities are all working and helping these people. And you look at it and say, maybe we should expand Medicaid. Would you be okay with my approach,
well,
or
they're out
is
there, right? I mean, they're out there
yeah?
and they haven't solved the problem. Um, I guess part of my concern with that, those nonprofits, they do a lovely job. I'm not against nonprofits, but there's something that's very inefficient about it. And if it's a service that we really want to exist, it's the highest cost per delivery system that you can get. And I say this as a person who's been to a million fundraisers for a million nonprofits. All my friends are involved in nonprofits, and I look at it and I think, okay, how are you going to do this? Are you going to do it through a government system where it's funded in the most efficient way possible? Frankly, I know you're going to hate this, but there's nothing more efficient, frankly, if you're going to be raising money to pay for a service than doing it through the tax system. Come straight. Nobody's spending, you know, 1,500 hours planning a chicken dinner and putting together gift baskets and organizing a raffle. I mean, when you raise money through the nonprofit sector, it takes a tremendous amount of time, and you're getting about 5 to 10 cents on the dollar for everything you raise. You have an army of volunteers killing themselves to raise this money, and it tends to be very haphazard. The help is going to go to the people who happen to be in a community where there happen to be a group of well-intentioned, usually ladies, who are willing to spend their weekends doing this. And if you don't live in that community, you are out of luck. And so you have 100 people spending 10,000 hours putting together a chicken dinner, putting together baskets to raise a trivial amount of money that is going to go in a completely erratic way to whoever happens to be in the path of those people. It's not very systematic. It's not very efficient. I think it's a little bit more efficient to have somebody whose job it is, who's an expert at it, to say, okay, these are the people who need it. We're going to have a system. This is how they apply. This is how we are going to efficiently get them the help they need from experts. That just feels to me like a more efficient way to raise and deploy dollars than to do it through a haphazard bunch of people organizing fundraisers.
But there's still inefficiency in Medicaid. I mean, it's now the state's single largest program. It's bigger than public schools.
The overhead on Medicaid, their administrative costs are the lowest you're going to find. It's 2% to between 2 and 3%. Their overhead, their administrative cost is 2 to 3%. There's nothing out there. Private insurance is more like 10 to 15% is lost to admin. When you look at it through the nonprofit sector, I think it's more like 70 to 80% is lost in terms of all of the effort put into fundraising and all of that. In terms of the dead weight loss that you're losing to administrative costs, the lowest you will ever find. I hate to tell you, I know you don't like Medicaid, but the lowest administrative cost you will ever find is through the Medicaid system.
Well, but what they count as administrative costs is one thing. There's also, I mean, wha- one of the things that we've been concerned about for years is the fact that the prescription of psychotropic drugs through the Medicaid system is far outpaces that in traditional private sector insurance. So you're talking anti-depression, anti-anxiety medicine, and especially since Medicaid expansion's taken off, it's like almost 2/3 of the
Yeah.
claims.
Well, I mean, you're right, is that the medication costs are the biggest driver of cost increases right now. That's coming from the pharmaceutical companies. So it's not just some of it's the antipsychotic drugs, some of it is the cancer treatment drugs. But the drug, that's what the pharmaceutical companies are charging for the drugs. You're not going to save any money by having, if it's a nonprofit buying those antipsychotics, they're going to be paying the same amount or more. If it's a private insurance company buying the anti-cancer drugs, it's going to be the same or more. It's whoever's, the money's going to that pharmaceutical company, and that's going to be a lot of money because they charge a lot of money. But that amount isn't going to be different based on who's buying it, whether it's a charity buying it or whether it's Medicaid buying it. Those drugs just cost a lot.
No, but I think if you go to a charity, you might have some other options besides just going and get some cancer drugs. I mean,
Well,
RSO, but you can't get that in Idaho.
well, I mean, there might be other treatments that we can talk about should be
I'm just
legalized.
saying that, but if you go to
But
Medicaid, you're not going to go and look at your cancer, your oncologist, and say, "Hey, can I go get some Rick Simpson oil to treat my cancer?" That's just going to be, no, I'm sorry, we have these drugs, chemotherapy, we've got radiation, and
well,
those are your options.
I mean, if you have cancer and an oncologist says you need this, chemotherapy drug X, you're not going to be any better off going to a charity than you're going to be going to Medicaid. Presumably, you need chemo drug X, and if you don't get it, you might die. And until somebody invents something different, I mean, it's not like a charity is going to have some magic dust that's different from what you're going to get through the chemo drugs you would get through Medicaid. You need that drug.
I don't know.
And
I think a charity might be a little bit more inclined to say, you know what, hold my beer. I'm going to go across the border to Ontario and get you some Rick Simpson oil, and we'll go use that on you and see how that goes. I mean, we see that all the time, by the way. I mean, we hear about this, not necessarily in Idaho, but in other places where that treatment has been shown to be effective in treating cancer. And so the folks that are in that system, though, they don't have that option. They're never going to have that option.
well, I would be very surprised if a whole lot of these, well-minded ladies, I don't mean to be ladies, there's also gentlemen involved in that, but that they're particularly eager to go sneak across the border and smuggle in illegal drugs. These are some very exciting charities you're working with. I would love to hear more about it. But I think generally the mainstream nonprofit sector
Well,
is working in the same sphere of drugs that the Medicaid world
yeah,
is working in.
and I'm not speaking specifically about cancer treatments or whatever. I'm just talking about it. It's
Mhm.
fascinating to me. I have a diametrically different opinion about the Medicaid system than you do. You put a lot of trust and faith in that system, and I look at it and go, "Gosh, we could be doing this so much better for so less money." And maybe actually, the concern that I have though is just the number of people. There is a delta. There is a difference between the number of people who are prescribed uh, um, um, antidepressant, anti-anxiety drugs on private insurance versus Medicaid, and we don't know the reason for that.
Well, I'd be curious to learn more. And to be clear, I think we always have to be vigilant. I don't think we should ever be in a state where like, oh, they're great. We're not going to look anymore. We're not going to, I think we always need to be making sure that we're examining and making sure that they are doing a good job and that there isn't waste and fraud, et cetera. I think vigilance has to be ongoing. But at least what I'm seeing so far, it has not caused me to think that things are going off the rails
Well,
at this juncture.
there is some concern that at least a six-figure sum of people are on Medicaid who probably shouldn't be on Medicaid in Idaho.
I think
I
a lot
forget
of
the
people
figure.
are
It's like
about to get
100
kicked off.
100,000 people or something like that. 100. I don't know the
I
exact
think,
number.
well, there's maybe about 70,000 people. It might turn out to be more. We don't know, but they're going to get kicked off soon. I mean, the federal emergency order is ending in April, and then all those people are going to start getting kicked off the rolls.
In a state where there's 450,000 people roughly on Medicaid, wouldn't that delta be described as waste?
Well, not all those people may be using Medicaid services because Medicaid is a payer of last resort. So if they have, we don't know who the heck these people are, honestly. We've been under this federal emergency order where they weren't allowed to kick anybody off. So a bunch of these people may be employed. They may have jobs where they have health insurance through the private sector, through their employer. In which case, they may not even be using Medicaid because if you have private insurance, you got to use that first. But I am very eager to have these people kicked off. To be clear, like I believe Medicaid should be there for the people who need it. I do not think we should be doing it for the people who don't need it. And so I'm happy that there will be an effort underway to prune it down to the people who truly need it.
But you say that, but there was a bill to repeal Medicaid expansion, and you'd be
Yeah.
100% against that.
Absolutely.
I would imagine. Doesn't Medicaid expansion take away from the people who absolutely positively need it?
Oh, they absolutely positively need. I put them in the camp of people who absolutely positively need it. I mean, let's look at the numbers on that. These are the people who are earning up to 138% of federal poverty line. Federal poverty line is preposterously low. It's been adjusted. I think it's about in the neighborhood of about 13,000 a year. So you're talking about people who are making up to 15,000 a year. Um, they're ridiculously poor. I mean, they are barely able to cover rent. I mean, they're food and electricity. There is no way they have extra money to be covering private health insurance. They don't have money for food and housing and electricity at that rate. So I consider them in the realm of people who should be on Medicaid. People who make 40, $50,000 a year, no. But the people who are in that level that would fall under Medicaid expansion, I'm comfortable with them being on Medicaid. I think they are really, really darn poor, and I don't see them having a financial option to be getting any access to healthcare but for Medicaid.
Isn't there something to be said for the fact that Medicaid expansion is costing us a lot more money than we thought it would? And that ultimately means a higher confiscatory tax policy on some of these people you're trying to help. So they're paying higher taxes to sustain the program. And then you turn around and say, here's your program I'm going to help you with
Well,
this money that you paid in. And
I mean, very frankly, the people that are in this category probably aren't paying much of anything in taxes. I mean, if you're making $14,000 a year, you don't have much of a tax bill.
but
You're probably getting money back.
every bit of it is concerning, and then one of the things that they're paying taxes on is 6% sales tax on their groceries, which is
Well, I'd
costing
love to
them
get there. Now we're starting to get to
costing
some
them a lot
agreement.
more.
I'd love to see grocery tax go away. No, absolutely. It's a terribly regressive tax. I'd love to see us get rid of grocery tax. I've co-sponsored that bill repeatedly. We've never been able to get a hearing.
What's the problem? I guess we'll switch to that topic. What's the
Yeah.
problem on that? Because you would think, I mean, I remember now going back, more than 20 years when Democrats were and conservative Republicans were very much in agreement about getting rid of the grocery tax. And here we
Yeah.
are. There was some movement about 5, 6 years ago, I guess, and nothing is really. Governor Little, before he got elected, said he agreed with repealing the grocery tax and has never introduced a single bill to do that. Even during the special session, when he
Yeah.
had absolute control over the agenda, he did not introduce a bill to get rid of the grocery tax. What is
Yeah.
happening with that?
Again, I would love to. I've co-sponsored several bills to get rid of grocery tax, and not one of them has ever gotten a
But
hearing.
why?
Well, I've because I've never been chair of the tax committee, of course.
Well,
Uh,
okay, since you're never going to be chair of the tax committee, what
but no, I can
what
give
are
you the
other
reasons.
options?
I mean, I can give you the reasons that have been given to me. Some of the reasons that have, I mean, I think that some of it is because they want these very, very poor people paying taxes. And I think there's a perception that the only way you could make them pay taxes is by making them pay grocery taxes. So, I think that's part of it is they want to,
Well, they're still
you
going to
know,
buy shampoo and soap
yep,
and
yep,
toilet paper and
yep.
I don't know.
Some of it is, arguments I've heard over the years are, it is a very stable tax source, I guess. When you have a downturn and people stop buying other discretionary goods, they'll keep buying groceries. So you will always have that money flowing in as long as you're collecting it.
Well, this
There are other stable forms of taxes, though. I mean, property tax is pretty stable. I mean, there's other, to me, that isn't enough of a selling point to keep charging taxes on groceries.
it seems kind of mean given that, food has gone up so much, and so who's benefiting from that except
Yeah.
your government that's collecting double the sales taxes on a carton of eggs that you used to buy for $2 now
Yeah.
is
No, I'm sold. I mean, I think most states don't have grocery tax, and I think we shouldn't. But I guess the other argument is that this is a way for us to tax people who come into Idaho, and that this way we're able to give the tax credit to the people who live here while taxing the tourists without giving them a tax credit. So it's a way to squeeze tourists for extra tax dollars. Is the argument that's been given to me. But again, I'd like to see it gone.
and the prospects for doing that are pretty much nil this legislative session. What are the prospects for any kind of tax relief according to your caucus? And
Um,
what proposals have you seen that you would be behind?
there's a bill that Representative Green has introduced to increase the child tax credit, which would help families pay for childcare since it looks like we're not going to get any childcare assistance money. um, apparently there's going to be a bill introduced, I think later this week or early next week on property taxes that would take the $120 million and some other monies to help pay down school bonds and to give some money to local governments to offset and drop property taxes. So we might see that. But I don't know. They don't tell me. I don't get invited into the secret smoke-filled rooms when they're plotting these things. I just see them at the same time you do when they get rolled out in committee.
Oh, no kidding. So you don't no one even invites anybody from the Democrats in to say, okay, what do you guys think of this? Maybe
Well,
you'll be
I
on board with
wish I
this.
would love to be invited to those meetings, but I'm not.
But your caucus is not going to be voting against property tax relief of some kind, I would imagine, right? And they already have your vote. They don't need you.
Well, I mean, they assume they don't need our votes, which is, I assume, why they don't invite us in the room and see what we think of the bills. But that said, I have no idea what things could look like. And one of the concerns, I am a big supporter of public schools, and if they're gonna, I very much want property tax relief, but I could see it being a problem if they take the money that's supposed to go to teacher raises and use that for it or something. I mean, I just got to see what all the moving parts are.
Let's talk about criminal justice before we get too far away from it,
Yeah,
because I know that's one of your passions, and
very much
and
so.
we do agree a lot on many of the criminal justice
Yeah.
components. So you got the clean slate bill we've been talking about for the last few years through the committee.
Yes, 3 years,
Talk
3
about
years.
that. What does that bill
I've
do?
been working on this for years. This is a bill that would provide a mechanism. This is something 42 other states have in one form or another, for people with minor criminal records. This is not for rapists and murderers, but people who have a shoplifting or a one-time marijuana possession charge or something like that, non-violent, non-sexual offenses, who have completed all of their sentencing and probation and whatever else, and gone at least 5 years without reoffending. It would provide a path for them to petition to seal the record, so that they would have better access to jobs and housing and you name it. And you'd be amazed all the things that happen to you when you have a record. There's so many things. You can't be a foster parent, and you can't get a work visa to travel, and you can't. I mean, a million things. So this is hopefully going to open up some options for people with minor nonviolent offenses. And it passed the Senate committee today unanimously.
I look, I was pretty interested in that bill. There was a time when I had some grief about the behind the scenes records that would be kept still by the government. So
Yeah.
your records being expunged, but there's still there's a secret cache of records
Well, it's still that
that
way.
no one can know about, but except for the government, which will they'll never
Eh,
access
eh,
that data at all
yeah.
ever.
Yeah. Well, I live in
You
the
know that's
world
going to
of
be the next thing, right?
well, so I'm in the world of you can't always get what you want.
Yeah,
And a lot of states, as I said, no two states are alike in how they do it, but many of them have true expungement where
yeah.
it's completely wiped clean,
That's what
gone.
I wanted to see.
I would have loved to see that. I tried that. I got smacked down,
Yeah.
and told that no way was with the prosecutors going to let that go ahead.
So they're gonna have a database. So
Yep.
your record's expunged, but the
Or
government or
sealed.
sealed rather, but they will still know
Yep.
that these things happen to
And that
you.
was part of the deal, is that it was my bill was going to get squished like a bug by prosecutors and law enforcement if it was true expungement. So they wanted something where it can be sealed from public view, but there will still be this database that prosecutors and police can see.
I like I said, I always thought that was reasonable because I think people are quite frankly arrested for stupid things, or you're a dumb kid and you make a mistake
Yep.
and it's on your record and then you got
Yep.
to go and go deal with that. So I've never really had a problem with that. The thing that kind of concerns me now, though, is I notice that some of the news media lately have taken to redacting things from their coverage.
Hmm.
Same kind of thing. So, like the
Hmm.
Idaho Statesman actually has a committee, which will, I'm not sure who's on the committee, but they have this process of reviewing articles. So let's say you, I don't know, what's a crime that would be expunged? A marijuana possession or
Yeah.
something. And there was an article in the paper, and the 17-year-old Ilana Rubel, and she did this stupid thing. And then you go to the newspaper some years later and you say, hey, there's this article there that I'd like to be removed. So
Yeah.
now you're actually erasing history, which I mean,
Yeah.
I kind of understand, okay, the government has released you from this thing that you did, but the total erasure of actual history from the permanent record, the official newspaper record of what took place
Well, I mean, I
seems like
guess
a
that's what my
lot.
bill does, right? Is it's erasing it from the public record maintained by the courts
Yeah,
of what you did. Uh,
but by the court, so as far as the government's concerned, this never happened. The newspaper still knows that it happened. It's still something
yeah.
that's in there. I just find that somehow the combination of those two things
Yeah.
is a bit troubling. So you're done with that issue though, that is in terms of get this bill
Well,
passed.
it's not quite at the finish line yet. It's still got to get through the Senate floor and the governor. But I'm not done with it though, because I want to do more.
What
I
is
got
it you want
smacked
to do
down.
next?
I had big dreams on this bill, and I got crushed into a little tiny version of what I wanted. I would have liked, frankly, to have more offenses be
Stand up to the
sealable.
fences. Yeah.
I would have loved, some element of true expungement. There was a lot I would have liked it to be automatic instead of this onerous
Get the
process where you
appeal.
have to hire a private lawyer and go through all these hearings. I would have, but again, more offenses. They wouldn't let very many offenses. I mean, the things that are on there are like littering and passing a school bus and stuff. I would like to be a little bit more generous to people who've turned over a new leaf.
Wasn't it were drug offenses on there too? I don't remember.
I was able to get the lowest level of drug offenses in
Okay.
there. So that was kind of a coup, actually.
Yeah.
But the lowest level of one-time drug possession at a personal usage amount
But
is sealable.
it passed the Senate Judiciary Committee today unanimously.
Yeah.
Which is, that wouldn't have happened not very long ago, actually.
Yeah.
Changes in Senate committee chairmanship can make a big difference.
Well, this isn't a Senate committee chair who I would have thought would be particularly friendly to the issue. But again, we made so many concessions and we shrunk down the bill to the point where I guess he was comfortable with it. Had I brought my original dream bill, I don't think Senator Leahy would have given it a hearing.
And what about just general drug policy issues? I mean, this year there was some hope that we'd get somewhere with mandatory minimums. It's interesting because there's actually a really good, not super good, but a pretty decent policy bill dealing with mandatory minimums, and it's House Bill 234, I think.
Yes, I'm a co-sponsor on that.
But because of the new House rules, it's sitting there in the office of the chief clerk. And I guess the good news is at least the really bad mandatory minimum bill for fentanyl, and explain to people why that's a bad bill, because a lot of people don't get this. Like, oh, fentanyl is terrible.
Fentanyl is terrible.
It is terrible.
Right.
So we need to lock up the people that are peddling pills of fentanyl.
And it's so frustrating because, the truth, I always say the truth doesn't fit on a bumper sticker. And this is one of those areas where, when you give your position, if you don't instantly say, I want this bill on fentanyl, everyone's like, you're trying to kill people. Don't you care about fentanyl? Yes, fentanyl is terrible. We absolutely should be doing things about fentanyl. But this was not the thing to do about fentanyl. This was not the thing. And the reasons why, I mean, there are so many problems with our current mandatory minimum statute, but particularly with fentanyl, our current mandatory minimum statute, they don't have to check the actual amount of drugs. And this applies to marijuana too. They just have to look, if you have a pan full of marijuana brownies that weighs a pound, 99% of it can be flour and sugar and eggs and oil and whatever else. With the tiniest bit of marijuana, they will treat the whole thing as a pound of marijuana. Right. And with fentanyl, that's a huge problem because minuscule amounts of fentanyl are often laced into larger amounts of something. And right now, they have no obligation to figure out how much actual fentanyl there is. So you could have 0.01 grams of fentanyl in a 10-gram pile of white powder. It might be sugar, who knows what, and they will treat it as 10 grams of fentanyl. And that is going to lead to massive injustice until they find a way to measure. Well, they can. The technology is there. The law just doesn't require them to use it.
So the bill that you and Judy worked on together actually expressly says that, and it addresses not just the fentanyl, but also marijuana, because there's also, believe it or not, we call it Idaho outpost A, B, C, D, and E. They're the ones that are just on the other side of the border. So all the cars in the parking lot in Ontario, they're from Idaho. The same is true in Pullman. The same is true in Clarkston. The same is true in Rathdrum, or what's on the other side of the border? Nevada. All these little outposts that are just on the other side of the border, and all the cars in the parking lot are Idaho. And what happens is people pick up a container of chocolates or some other thing, gummy bears or whatever they may be, and that it's a certain amount of THC, but the whole container and how much it weighs is what's going to be used, and suddenly you're a felon.
Exactly. All the sugar, all the gelatin. And that gets to another point, which is our current statute doesn't require, they call it trafficking, but that's a very misleading term because they don't require that you actually sell anything or even that you intend to sell anything.
I was explaining
that. It can be purely for personal use, and they will call you a trafficker. So that was part of what our bill did, is that you have to actually be a dealer.
I was explaining that to an ex-cop today who was really mad at me because of the position that we had taken on this issue. And I said, this is and maybe you can think of another crime where this is true. This is the only crime that I can think of where you can actually be convicted of something that you never actually did. And that's what, so you're a drug trafficker, and the guy that's using marijuana or heroin or whatever, personal use, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, the fact is that you're a trafficker. It doesn't mean you don't have to traffic to anybody, but you're still a trafficker.
Exactly.
And my comment was, look, go after the trafficker. I'm fine with that. You know, take on the person who's selling drugs to kids or people, adults who die or whatever, and take them on for doing exactly that. They are traffickers. They're bad. You ought to do something about that. But the guy that's just, you know, going over across the line and getting a bunch of pot, and next thing you know, he's a trafficker because he just possesses it without ever dealing with anybody.
That's exactly right.
That's
We
crazy.
got serious problems with our current statute, and you're exactly right. They've taken possession and decided to call it trafficking.
And then what happens is you get arrested for something, and the prosecutor now has this leverage. It's not necessarily going to put you in prison for 15 years or whatever. I don't remember, is it 15 years or 10
Well,
years?
it depends on the amount.
marijuana?
It can be 15, it can be 5, 10, 15, 30, depending
But
on the
anyway,
amount.
mandatory minimum requiring, this is the absolute amount of time you must serve in prison. And what they'll do is they'll say, okay, we'll give you X if you plead down to something else, and you're compelled to take it because who wants to be in prison for 5 to 15 years?
Oh, 100%. I mean, it gives such a club to the prosecutors. I've heard from criminal defense attorneys who have said, I've had clients who I believe were innocent, and we would have liked to go to trial and try to prove their innocence, but we didn't dare roll the dice because the possibility of the mandatory minimums were so extreme that we advise our client to plead guilty to a crime they didn't commit just to avoid the mandatory minimum. I mean, it's just a travesty in our justice system. So we got to fix that. And you know, let's fix that and then go after fentanyl.
Does it look like that would happen this year?
I'm hoping. There's still conversations going on. Hope is not dead yet. Hope is not dead yet. That's the only reason, you know, all in all, I'd like to see the session wrap up sooner rather than later, but I will happily stick around if it means we can fix mandatory minimums.
All right. We covered a lot of topics. What else? Anything else you want to dial in here before we adjourn this discussion?
Oh, well, you know, I guess I'm gonna throw you a curveball. You've thrown me so many. I'm coming at you, Wayne.
Come on, bring it on. Bring it on.
Well, I was really surprised to see a positive score on that, you know, what they call the drag ban bill. Just because it was so over broadly drafted that it could really conceivably extend to almost any kind of performing arts. It would extend to, you know, it just goes after sexually provocative performances, which is totally undefined. Could be people doing a high school performance of Grease or a cheerleading routine or whatever. And in attire that accentuates sexual characteristics, which could be a push-up bra or a tight leotard or something. And I was really concerned about something that exposes people to vast liability for doing really kind of mainstream performance. You know, I know it was framed as like, it's all perverted stuff, but it reached a lot of stuff that was not perverted.
Yeah, that's a fair question. We have a team of people that review legislation. I think, I don't remember how many bills we've done so far this year. It's north of 300, I think. It's a lot of bills.
You read a lot. Yep.
And so I looked at that bill. I'm still not sure about it personally. I know what my analysts say about it. Yes, it's +1. I'm still looking at it, so I still hold open the possibility we might take a second look at it.
I'm gonna advocate for a downgrade on that one.
I don't know. As you probably know, people will come to us all the time through a legislative session and will say, Wayne, you rated this bill a particular way. Is this right? And we'll kind of make a note of it and go back and say, we'll take a look at it later on and make sure, because the one thing that we want to do is make sure that they're actually accurate.
Yeah.
Sometimes we get time and we'll go ahead and we'll revise them as a session. Is on my radar one we might go back and take a second look. And I don't know that we will, but it's one of those that there's probably maybe a handful of bills that have come up this year that we've actually had to go back and it's pretty normal. Out of 300 bills, you get 2 or 3 that you think, I don't know about this one. This one fits in that camp because I'm just not sure. It tries to thread the needle of protecting minors and protecting performances at the same time, and I'm not really
Yeah.
sure if it quite gets there.
I
I
think
don't
they dropped
know.
the ball hard on
Yeah,
protecting performances.
yeah, I don't know. And there was somebody that called me and voiced the same concern that you voiced on the floor the other day with
Yeah.
regard to performances that
Well, right.
might operatic or ballet
Right.
performances, and I hadn't heard that before, and it kind of got me thinking a little bit more about it.
Yeah.
So I don't
Well,
know.
thanks. I take
It's
another look because when you look at the language, it encompasses everything almost
it encompasses
imaginable
a
in the
lot,
world of
and
performance.
the thing that I get to though is okay. So does this change? I mean, ultimately, the question that you ask on every single bill is, are you more free or less free with this passage of legislation? And there are a variety of different ways you can be more or less free. It might be,
Mm.
raising a tax or raising a fee. I mean, those things make you a little less free in our view
Yeah.
because you have less money to spend, or you money that you have earned has been taken away from you. For example, in this case, you asked that question about this profession, this
Yeah.
vocation
Yeah.
of performance art, and
Yeah.
I don't know the answer on that.
Well, I
But
would say if you can't do a cheerleading routine without getting sued by for $10,000 or more, then you're
well,
probably less free.
and that's a question that you would ask is okay.
Yeah.
So you would you might initially think that this doesn't apply to you, and then somebody comes and says, "Well, you owe us $10,000 because you're wearing a provocative cheerleading skirt."
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
okay, so I don't know.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where it's on the it's certainly in the radar. It's on the
Yeah.
radar. Yep. So
Excellent. Well, I'm very passionate about civil liberties and free speech and all of that. So,
there's a
uh,
place where if you draw a Venn diagram, there's an overlap for us for this. I consider you a bit of a leftist. That's fine, but there is an overlap if you draw a Venn diagram of
mhm.
where we are, and so those things are very important. I don't know how much of a civil libertarian I would consider you, but whatever, it's fine. It's
I consider myself very much a civil libertarian.
You might not consider me one, I guess, as it turns out. So whatever. All right. Any other topics you want to bring up before
No,
we?
well, not unless you have any. No, this I think we've covered a lot of
We have
territory.
covered a
Hopefully,
lot of
we've
territory. Maybe by now the snow has stopped and you can go home without having to worry about having to dig your way there. But I really appreciate you being on the show.
absolutely my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Tell your caucus members this is not so scary. It's just a lot of fun every time. I always enjoy it. And we'll be back. And actually, we have a special fun Hoff Time Report coming up on Friday, where I'm going to bring in our development operations director, Allie Meagle, will be with us to talk about some interesting things about the nature of life and government. And hey, it's just be a fun, round, weird conversation. I hope so. Hope you'll join us for that too. We'll talk to you again soon. Thank you. Good night.
You've been listening to the Hoff Time Report with Wayne Hoffman. Be sure to visit idahofreedom.org for Wayne's articles, IFF research, and show notes from today's episode.